Hello, welcome to the first reading of our new book. It's called Truckers by Terry Pratchett, and it's all about some gnomes who live in a department store, like, I don't know, Debenhams or Marks and Spencer's or Phoenix, one of those big shops that seems to sell everything. There's a really important bit before we get to chapter 1. Called Concerning Gnomes and Time. Gnomes are small. On the whole, small creatures don't live for a long time. But perhaps they do live fast. Let me explain. One of the shortest lived creatures on planet Earth is an adult common mayfly. It lasts for 1 day. The longest living things are the bristlecone pine trees at 4,700 years and still counting. This may seem tough on mayflies, but the important thing is not how long your life is, but how long it seems. To a mayfly, a single hour may last as long as a century. Perhaps old mayflies sit around complaining about how life this minute isn't a patch on the good old minutes of long ago, when the world was young and the sun seemed so much brighter and lava showed you a bit of respect. Whereas the trees, which are not famous for their quick reactions, may just have time to notice the way the sky keeps flickering before the dry rot and woodworms set in. It's all a sort of relativity. The faster you live, the more time stretches out. To a gnome, a year lasts as long as 10 years does to a human. Remember it. Don't let it concern you. They don't. They don't even know. Chapter 1. This is the story of the going home. This is the story of the lorry roaring through the sleeping city and out into the country lanes, smashing through street lamps and swinging from side to side and shattering shop windows and rolling to a halt when the police chased it. And when the baffled men went back to their car to report, "Listen, will you listen? There isn't anyone driving it." It became the story of the lorry that started up again, rolled away from the astonished men, and vanished into the night. But the story didn't end there. It didn't start there either. The sky rained dismal. It rained humdrum. It rained the kind of rain that is so much wetter than normal rain. The kind of rain that comes down in big drops and splats. The kind of rain that is merely an upright sea with slots in it. It rained a tattoo on the old hamburger boxes and chip papers in the wire basket that was giving Masklin a temporary hiding place. Look at him. Masklin. Wet. Cold. Extremely worried. And 4 inches high. The waste bin was usually a good hunting ground, even in winter. There were often a few cold chips in their wrapping, sometimes even a chicken bone. Once or twice there had been a rat, too. It had been a really good day when there had last been a rat. It kept them going for a whole week. The trouble was that you could get pretty fed up with rat by the 3rd day. By the 3rd mouthful, come to that. Masklin scanned the lorry park. And here it came, right on time, crashing through the puddles and pulling up with a hiss of brakes. He'd watched this lorry arrive every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the last 4 weeks. He timed the driver's stop carefully. They had exactly 3 minutes. To someone the size of a gnome, that's more than half an hour. He scrambled down through the greasy paper, dropped out of the bottom of the bin and ran for the bushes along the edge of the park where Grimmer and the old folk were waiting. "It's here," he said. "Come on." They got to their feet, groaning and grumbling. He'd taken them through this dozens of times. He knew it wasn't any good shouting. They just got upset and confused, and then they'd grumble some more. They grumbled about cold chips, even when Grimmer warmed them up. They moaned about rat. He'd seriously thought about leaving them alone, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. They needed him. They needed someone to grumble at. But they were too slow. He felt like bursting into tears. He turned to Grimmer instead. "Come on," he said. "Give them a prod or something. They'll never get moving." She patted his hand. "They're frightened," she said. "You go on. I'll bring them out." There wasn't time to argue. Masklin ran back across the soaking mud of the park, unslinging the rope and grapnel. It had taken him a week to make the hook out of a bit of wire teased off a fence, and he'd spent days practicing. He was already swinging it around his head as he reached the lorry's wheel. The hook caught the tarpaulin high above him at the second try. He tested it once or twice, and then, his feet scrabbling for a grip on the tyre, pulled himself up. He'd done it before. He'd done it 3 or 4 times. He scrambled under the heavy tarpaulin and into the darkness beyond, pulling out more line and tying it as tightly as possible around one of the ropes that was as thick as his arm. Then he slid back into the edge and, thank goodness, Grimmer was herding the old people across the gravel. He could hear them complaining about the puddles. Masklin jumped up and down with impatience. It seemed to take hours. He explained it to them millions of times, but people hadn't been pulled up onto the backs of lorries when they were children, and they didn't see why they should start now. Old Granny Morky insisted that all the men look the other way so they wouldn't see up her skirts, for example. And old Torrit whimpered so much that Masklin had to lower him down again so that Grimmer could blindfold him. It wasn't so bad after he'd hauled the first few up, because they were able to help on the rope. But time still stretched out. He pulled Grimmer up last. She was light. They were all light, if it came to that. You didn't get rat every day. It was amazing. They were all on board. He'd worked with an ear cocked for the sound of footsteps on gravel and the slamming of the driver's door, and it hadn't happened. "Right," he said, shaking with the effort. "That's it then. Now if we just go—" "I dropped the thing," said old Torrit. "The thing. I dropped it, d'you see? I dropped it down by the wheel when she was blindfolding me. You go get it, boy." Masklin looked at him in horror. Then he poked his head out from under the tarpaulin, and yes, there it was, far below. A tiny black cube on the ground. The thing. It was lying in a puddle, although that wouldn't affect it. Nothing touched the thing. It didn't even burn. And then he heard the sound of slow footsteps on the gravel. "There's no time," he whispered. "There really is no time." "We can't go without it," said Grimmer. "Of course we can. It's just a thing. We won't need the wretched object where we're going." He felt guilty as soon as he'd said it, amazed at his own lips for uttering such words. Grimmer looked horrified. Granny Morky drew herself up to her full, quivering height. "May you be forgiven," she barked. "What a terrible thing to say. You tell him, Torrit." She nudged Torrit in the ribs. "If we ain't taking the thing, I ain't going," said Torrit sulkily. "It's not—" "That's your leader talking to you," interrupted Granny Morky. "So you do what you're told. Leave it behind, indeed. It wouldn't be decent. It wouldn't be right. So you go get it this minute." Masklin stared wordlessly down at the soaking mud and then, with a desperate motion, threw the line over the edge and slid down it. It was raining harder now, with a touch of sleet. The wind whipped at him as he dropped past the great arc of the wheel and landed heavily in the puddle. He reached out and scooped up the thing, and the lorry started to move. First there was a roar so loud that it went beyond sound and became a solid wall of noise. Then there was a blast of stinking air and a vibration that shook the ground. He pulled sharply on the line and yelled at them to pull him up, and realised that even he couldn't hear his own voice. But Grimmer or someone must have got the idea, because just as the big wheel began to turn, the rope tightened and he felt his feet lifted off the mud. He bounced and spun back and forth as, with painful slowness, they pulled him past the wheel. It turned only a few inches away from him, a black, chilly blur, and all the time the hammering sound battered at his head. "I'm not scared," he told himself. "This is much worse than anything I've ever faced, and it's not frightening. It's not too terrible. It's just—" It was too terrible to be frightening. He felt as though he was in a tiny warm cocoon away from all the noise and the wind. I'm going to die, he thought, just because of this thing which has never helped us all. Something that's just a lump of stuff, and now I'm going to die. I wonder if old Torrit is right about what happens when you die. It seems a bit severe to have to die to find out. I've looked at the sky every night for years, and I've never seen any gnomes up there, any sign of heaven at all. But it didn't really matter. It was all outside to him. It wasn't real. He was too scared. Then Hans reached down and caught him under the arms and dragged him into the booming space under the tarpaulin and, with some difficulty, prized the thing out of his grip.